Here's the first motion picture to offer to the daring a look into the final, maddening space between life and death. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Sights and sounds far beyond anything you've tested.
Listen up, kid. You gotta know a few things. People look back on the 1970s with nostalgia. They shouldn't. It was a toilet-flush decade, and everyone caught in the swirl felt like shit. It was all gonna end in the sewer. That was obvious. An impeached American president resigns in disgrace. America's vaunted military surrenders to a third world country. The Soviet Union was poised to take over the free world and kill Jesus again. Teenagers would lose their virginity to commie infiltrators, while apple pie would run crimson with American blood. Of course, some good things happened too. For instance, Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, America's first great independent zombie film. The utter madness of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre followed in 1973. Halloween haunted 1978 with Michael Myers trick-or-treating wayward teens to death in middle-class America. Jason Voorhees jumped out of Camp Crystal Lake in 1980 and went berserk on sex-crazed camp counselors. And in 1984, Freddy Krueger crawled out of the boiler room to chop fornicators into sushi. By 1984, the great American canon of horror films had been firmly established, and we have that terrible decade to thank. God bless America. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My favorite time of year was fall. In October 1978, I was 13 years old and Halloween had finally arrived. For weeks, I had seen commercials for a film called Halloween on our family room TV set. The tagline read, "Halloween, the night he came home." Michael Myers, that is, and I knew immediately that he was looking for me. The day before Halloween was Devil's Night, and kids played neighborhood pranks up and down the block. I was one of the worst. Soap, water balloons, eggs, and toilet paper were my stock and trade. Luckily, the Halloween costumes hid our identities. The next night when we went trick-or-treating, I had wickedness and vice in my heart, and my grandmother knew it, and she would tell me, "You got the devil in them eyes, boy, and someday a demon's gonna come grab you and drag you to hell." All these things crossed my mind that night while looting candy on our big, lonely, dark block. I was the last one still outside. The others went home to gloat over their haul of sugar. I wanted a little more for bragging rights. This night came but once a year after all. It was just short of 11 p.m., past my normal bedtime, but it was a holiday with special privileges down near the canal by the side of the woods. I counted out my booty. The wind rose suddenly and it began to rain, so I decided to head home. But then the corner of my eye caught something moving out across the street near the old black spruce stand. Maybe one of the big kids still trick-or-treating? I focused and listened. The wind rattled the wet trees and sprayed my costume all damp. He stopped and turned his head in my direction. I was hiding. He couldn't actually see me, right? His right hand sprung up and I saw the enormous butcher knife shoot forward like Judgment Day. I sprang from the bushes like a rabbit and bolted home. Half my candy spilled across the darkened road in my panicked retreat, but I didn't care. I burst through the back door of my house and dove into my bedroom. I stared out the window for hours and hours, making sure he did not follow me home.
This fall, 2018, the Halloween franchise will be rebooted by the very man who created the series some 40 years ago, John Carpenter. Needless to say, horror film buffs across the country are thrilled. If you're not familiar with the mythology of the franchise, it's basically the story of the Myers family and their 3 children, Judith, Michael, and Laurie. The action takes place in middle-class suburb of Haddonfield, Illinois. The storyline itself is broken into 2 sections. The beginning section takes place during Halloween night 1963, when Michael is 8 years old and being babysat by his 16-year-old older sister Judith. She is making out with her boyfriend on the living room couch. The 2 go upstairs to have sex in her bedroom. Shortly afterwards, the boyfriend leaves and Michael climbs the stairs and stabs his older sister to death with a butcher knife. After the murder, he is committed to Smith's Grove Psychiatric Hospital for an undisclosed amount of time. We see stages of Michael's institutional captivity through the eyes of his psychiatrist, Dr. Loomis, who has come to a very unscientific conclusion about his catatonic ward, namely that he is pure evil, or more particular, that some inhuman force is biding its time in his body, waiting for an unseen trigger to explode again in murderous violence. In 1978, he escapes this loony bin and returns home to pursue his younger sister Laurie, now turned 16. In that process, he cuts a bloody swath through Haddonfield's unwary teen populace. The film Halloween was shot entirely in Los Angeles, but set in mythic Haddonfield, Illinois, enhancing the horror of mass murder by staging it in a small, idyllic town beset by a homicidal 8-year-old. Laurie Strode embodies the Sweet 16 stereotype favored by romantic ballads of the 50s and early 1960s. In contrast, the popular lyrics of the late 1960s and early 1970s are infused with references to social distress, military aggression, and youthful rebellion. The Halloween story was set and released in 1978, and the script reflects social trends of that time period. Most noticeably, the manner in which Carpenter visualizes horny suburban teenagers having sex, drinking beer, and smoking dope. Behavioral traits linking them to the late 60s and early 1970s countercultural movement, making them perfect targets for a sexually repressed psychopath. Laurie Strode, a Girl Scout and a virgin, is the last person standing, suggesting that virtue and purity are traits that make you immune to Michael's puritanical vengeance. As a result, Michael Myers became an accidental symbol to the counterculture rooted in American Puritanism, a silent, less visible spectrum that sat in opposition to the visible bombast of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In short, he was an antidote to the hippies. His time in the mental asylum approximately bookends America's involvement in the Vietnam War, 1963 to 1978. Michael's story is thus broken into 2 iconic time periods, pre-Vietnam America and post-Vietnam America. In 1975, America capitulates an armistice to end the Vietnam War. The soldiers return home, but not always to a hero's welcome. America had been disgraced on a world stage by a third world country, and the country was in shock. Further, because of the many atrocities committed during the war, such as the infamous My Lai massacre, many towns were actually fearful of their returning soldiers. The 1978 ad campaign for Halloween featured the following tagline, "The night he came home." The line overtly references Michael's escape and return from the mental asylum. However, it inadvertently echoes subconscious fears about returning soldiers afflicted with post-traumatic stress disorder. As the decade of the 1970s began to close, a new narrative for the Vietnam fiasco was beginning to emerge from the far right. The hippies and their lifestyle had offended God and incurred his disfavor. Mainstream Americans were ready to crucify the traitorous lot to make the country great again. a perfect political storm that helped Reagan launch his conservative revolution in the 1980s, in which he pounded conservative themes that featured a return to traditional values, the Bible, nuclear families, and nuclear missiles. These were the only things keeping America free from hippies, traitors, and the Russian hordes. Set in small-town America, Halloween became an unlikely cultural crucible for these explosive political tensions. Michael Myers turned into the unlikely embodiment of the furious right that demonized hippies as enemies of the state. Michael Myers then became judge, jury, and executioner, prosecuting a cultural witch hunt against perceived un-American activities on the domestic home front.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the horror-thon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks. The clock is ticking. It's almost time.
Happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween.